Well, it turns out that the miracle of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the tilma of Juan Diego, and the conversion of millions and millions of Mesoamericans was not just something out of the blue, but something God prepared for thousands of years. I'll be right back. Gracious gang, it's Mike Creevy, host of the Gracious Guest Show, here with you for another episode of the show that's all about the intersection of faith and culture, and it's a really exciting chat we're going to be having today. So before we get into that, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this far and wide. We're releasing it on the memorial of St. Juan Diego. We're coming up on the beloved, wonderful feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Can't see it off screen here. You'll see it in the interview, but I have my giant tilma replica here on my wall I see every day. This incredibly powerful story that I was, marginally aware of, but I had no idea what I was really getting myself into. And I found this book. Let me grab it here quick. Carry it with me a lot of places now. So Guadalupe and the Flower World Prophecy, How God Prepared the Americas for Conversion Before the Lady Appeared, by authors Joseph Julián Gonzalez and his wife Monique Gonzalez, who joined me on the show today to discuss this book. And what's really fascinating about it, as you'll see, is the tilma plays a role in it, but this isn't primarily just about the miraculous image on the tilma. That factors in, but there's a whole much deeper and more fascinating and far more ancient sort of backstory to all of this that I had no idea about until I read the book. So let me give you the brief background bios here for Joseph and Monique. Joseph Julián Gonzalez is a composer for award-winning films, TV shows, stage productions, and concerts. His music has been performed at Carnegie Hall, the Sydney Opera House, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, the Vatican, and other prestigious venues. A 30-year Hollywood veteran, Gonzalez's composing credits include the Academy Award-winning nominated feature Colors Straight Up, the Emmy Award-winning Made in L.A., and the Peabody Award-winning 6-part miniseries Latino Americans. Gonzalez conducted the Bulgarian National Radio Symphony Orchestra for his award-winning PBS landmark documentary Children of Giant. He also co-composed the score to Quentin Tarantino's Curdled with rock and roll legend Slash from Guns N' Roses. So that's pretty cool. And his wife Monique Gonzalez has studied classical voice and has been a professional cantor at several prominent churches in Los Angeles, New York City, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. Monique has worked in marketing and promotions for various Catholic apostolates, including You Magazine, Legatus, Defenders of the Catholic Faith, and Ave Maria Radio. She has racked up a sizable credit list as music editor and score production coordinator for several movies and feature documentaries. She has been the producer of internationally recorded full orchestra scores, including the award-winning PBS documentary Children of Giant, and singer on the Peabody Award-winning miniseries Latino Americans. She authored the libretto for the 3-act opera Sueños de Béjar, or Dreams of Béjar, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Joseph and Monique Gonzalez to talk about Our Lady and all that God did to prepare the way for her wonderful appearance in 1531 in Mexico. Check it out. Joseph and Monique, thank you so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show. I'm delighted to talk to you both today.
Thank you for having us, Mike.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, we had to do some rearrangement earlier, but I've got my tilma back here. I wanted to really, kind of get the theme going for today. So this, I have my copy here of Guadalupe and the Flower World Prophecy right here. As I was telling you before we started recording, just a marvelous read, and so intriguing, so much more than I expected really to discover. So before we get into discussing that, why don't we just start off talking a little bit about your own backgrounds a little bit and kind of what led you to to thinking about this topic in this deep way.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thanks for having us. My name is Joseph Julián Gonzalez. I was born in Southern California. And since an early age, I was always fascinated by music, so I decided to make that my career. I went to UCLA and got a degree in classical guitar and composition for motion picture and television, and started a career, basically, after a couple of stints teaching music in some, colleges. But then I decided I'd give it a go and go into Hollywood. And I started writing music for film and television and documentaries. And I also had a side career where I was writing classical concert music. So I was writing string quartets, chamber music, etc. And I decided, and this is pertinent to our story, is I decided that I wanted to set Aztec flower song poems to music. Now, I knew that that existed because I believe it was a class that I took at UCLA. And so I dove into that, this whole genre, found out there was about 180 known Aztec flower song poems that were collected within the few decades after the fall of the Aztec Empire, which would be 1521. And of course, Guadalupe appeared in 1531, a decade after the fall. And this is pertinent because when I started reading these flower song poems, and of course, as a composer, I had to really get into them. I had to get into the emotion. I had to get into what they were saying because I was setting them to music. I found this flower song poem at a collection called The Songs of the Aztecs. It was translated by an anthropologist named John Beerhorst. It had just barely been translated in 1985. Now, I found the book in the early 1990s, so this is how far back it goes with me. And then, of course, we'll hear Monique's story. I found this poem that talked about a singer who wanted to collect flowers so he could put them in his tilma and bring them down and show them to the lords and princes. And I thought, whoa, this sounds very much like the Guadalupe story.
Yeah.
And, back in the early 1990s, all the scholarship was secular. And basically what I kept getting from all the sources is that, of course, what we know is going on here is this must be the source material for a fabricated Guadalupe narrative. In other words, a fake mythic story.
Sure.
And that really threw me off. It really hurt my faith for many years until 2009 when I met Monique, and she can carry on the story from there.
Yeah. So what happened at that point, we had just met, and just to give a little preamble, I'm from Southern California. I'm a trained singer as well. So that prepared me for meeting Joseph, as I've been studying, voice, classical voice and theory. So when I met him in 2009, we hit it off pretty quickly, as well as I had the resume that he could hire me as his assistant.
Well, we knew we were going to get
we knew from the moment. but hypothetically, in the moment, he was like,
he was my assistant.
I need an assistant. Can you come help me out? I'm like, okay, sure. And in the process of that, I got pulled into this narrative. And the reason why that happened, just to explain quickly, 3 years prior, I had had an experience with Our Lady of Guadalupe where she healed me of some very serious things. So that prepped me mentally to go, why did she do that? So then fast forward 3 years, I meet Joseph, and he has a concert piece that's going to Carnegie Hall. They wanted to perform the entire concert piece, which is about 8 different movements or pieces of music. That's going to be done.
That I was working on in the 90s.
It's going to be done in its entirety. So he wanted to make some adjustments and changes. He hands me the book and says, can you help me find some more poetry to compose a couple more pieces? So as you do, you go to the beginning. And what's at the very beginning is this song called The Origin of Songs. And it sounds just like the Guadalupe story. And I'm like, Joseph, what is this? It sounds a little bit too close. And he's like, well, yeah, that's true, but flip to the back of the book and see what the author says. And the author is
the translator,
basically saying, not the author, the translator of the songs. He's basically saying the person who created the Guadalupe story must have had access to this previous song.
Sure.
And this is what he built it on. So this started this whole conversation back and forth of Joseph and I going, there's something off here. Why don't we investigate it further? Because, we know God answers these kinds of questions. So that started a 14-year legacy, basically.
Yeah.
Of
and research.
And I know this is such a silly little detail maybe, but I found it tremendously helpful. Just, as you go through the book, you guys have the sort of phonetic spelling, right? For at least like the first time some of those terms come out. That was so helpful. But so I want to see if I'm getting some of them right as we go. But so the song, the origin of the song, is it the Cuicapecayotl? Is that right?
Cuicapecayotl. Very good.
Very close.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Close. All right. So and so that, and remind me here. So what's, as best we can tell, what's the Now, I mean, well, with oral traditions too, and I of course do talk about this and like discussing the composition of scripture, for example, that you have, sometimes this indeterminate, right, sort of length of an oral tradition that eventually gets written down in more or less of a final form that we have. So could you just remind me here that like, what are we looking at for, as far as we can tell, how old that story might be, as best we can tell, and then when the form we have it in might come from?
The conjecture among the scholars is that it might be as old as the actual belief system that it's talking about, potentially. So where that dating comes in, maybe you want to set up a little bit more?
It quite possibly might have come from the middle formative Olmec period, which puts it around 1500 BC.
Yeah.
Many different scholars speculate that these certain concepts of this flower world paradise, which we're going to talk about, and this transcendental aspect of a flower could have quite possibly happened or concurred with the high cultivation of corn or maize.
Yes. Yeah.
And
that happened.
This one professor from UC Riverside, Carl Taup, that's where he really kind of puts the beginning of this. And as we step through in the book, we talk about certain kind of concepts. For example, the axis mundi and the idea of a cave, a four-lobed cave being underneath a mountain, that it corresponds actually to different concepts that you find in this early poem, the origin of the songs that we've been talking about. But it also branches out into other flower song poems that were collected centuries later.
Sure.
But because of this, we believe specifically, and we make a case that it quite possibly could be from the very inception of flower world itself.
In the Americas.
And this was so fascinating to me, because when you, as I told you before we started recording, technically, I mean, if you just go off of what my senior history thesis was about, I got a little kind of cornered because there was only so much I could choose from. But I ended up being a Civil War history major. But on my way to that, as kind of the culminating, kind of undergrad work I did before moving into theology for my graduate work, and history remains a tremendous interest for me, especially American history kind of broadly. I had a course, I think my junior year of college, on the sort of age of discovery. And it was so fascinating to me because it was the first time I had ever read any primary sources about any of this, so like I had grown
primary
up,
sources.
I grew up with the pretty standard, kind of textbook, which aren't usually even secondary, they're more like tertiary sources, but like a kind of, textbook explanation of, this era. And what's interesting is I was coming of age when I think, and this is something I think you guys do very well. Don't worry, I'm coming to a question. Something you guys do very well, I think, throughout in a few places, where I think, sometimes we get these extremes sometimes in the narrative, right? So I think for a long time, kind of, early US kind of history, you had almost like a hagiographic kind of, like Columbus and Cortez, like these people were these saints who came and who were just these, like, destined to do all these wonderful things. But then I was coming of age right in the kind of peak, I think, of a time when it was swinging to the other sort of extreme, where there's just this wicked, evil, mustache twirling, nothing but evil intent. Everything was evil and just devastation. And it wasn't until I took that course that I got to actually see, we were looking at primary sources from both sides. We were getting this window into a little differentiation, and that's what my question is going to be about. And maybe I'm doing this too early, because we can jump back and forth too to kind of fill in the gaps more. But looking at this, what the Spanish sort of discover, like I want to build up to that, maybe what they come into, what the world they come into, very alien and foreign to them. But we help us see how it's not like a monolithic thing, right? There's a distinction to be made, right, between the Mexico or the Aztec kind of culture that's into some awful stuff, versus some of these other tribes and peoples. Can you kind of walk us through at least a summary of kind of that development there?
I'm glad you're doing that. Oh boy, that's really great.
That's a great question.
Because I found that very essential in your book to better understanding this philosophy and why why it's not fair, for example, for those even the early missionaries to be looking at it, most of the people they're dealing with, as if they're on board with this human sacrificing culture, because that seems like sort of the odd man out.
Yes.
Oh God, that's such a great question because these flower song poems were hidden for so many years, and really they came out in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
But it took so long for them to be translated. They really didn't start coming of age until like 1930, 1940. And then when the primary
Blossom in the 50s and
expert
60s.
in the 50s, they came about. That's actually when we began to know a whole genre of philosophy, of Native American philosophy called Nahua philosophy comes about, really with the publication in Spanish of a book called Nahua Philosophy by Miguel Leon Portilla. Unfortunately, it was really kind of, as it went through the 60s and the 70s, so many of these different things were questioned. And of course, a lot of what is now known as kind of the Spanish Black legend starts to come in, and there was anti-colonial, anti-Spanish, which is still around today, of course.
Can you explain Black legend a little bit better so people know it?
Right. Okay. What we kind of see going on here with American history, that Thomas Jefferson had slaves, that George Washington, all this other stuff, it's happening in the Spanish-speaking world too. So it's basically where everything is questioned and everything is really interpreted as bad. And of course, what that does, even though there are kernels of truth in there, it's hard to really kind of get to the real story. And when you begin to go, like to your point, when you go back to some of these original source materials like we did, not only in the Spanish language, in archaic Spanish language, but also in the classic, what is called classical Nahuatl, you get such a different picture. And of course, kind of the debate over what do these flower songs mean. Of course, Miguel Leon Portilla had more of a Platonic realism type interpretation of a transcendental realm, kind of like the allegory of the cave, where perfection exists. Very much that what these songs mean. I'm sure we're going to get into it. That when you're talking about a flower on earth being a symbol to be able to reach a transcendental reality where the perfect forms exist. He explained it in very kind of Platonic forms. But of course, later on, there was so much debate about, Plato and his interpretations of the word. I'm thinking of like Heidegger and different kind of philosophies that kind of took hold in the 20th century. So of course, there was a lot of kind of criticism that came about that was mixed into kind of the different interpretations of Spanish history. And then, of course, there was a backlash against that. I'm thinking primarily of that book that came out in the 1980s, Warren Carroll, and the
Conquest of
Darkness, which there, of course, are kernels of truth in there, too. But
it whitewashes everything.
It painted Cortez and everybody as saints. And I hope I'm not ruffling too many feathers right now. But the thing about it is that was a pendulum that seemed to swing far in another direction.
Yeah, sure.
So, as we were saying, we were into this for 14 years, and we had to read through so many different books.
About Cortez and about Columbus and about the tensions, and kind of speaking to your point, it's easier to kind of paint one group as just being all evil and another as being all good, and just kind of leave it at that point. But God oftentimes works in the nuances and in the humanity of who we are. And it's not that simple.
It's not that simple.
And through our suffering, you know.
Exactly. I could just say, like, excuse me, just one conclusion that we came to is it Aztec good, Spanish bad? Is it Spanish good, Aztec bad? And really
irredeemability.
Who is redeemable? And we found that, God wants to redeem everybody.
Yeah. I think
everybody is sinners.
Sin is bad.
Yeah.
Right. And it's in all of us somewhere, and that I'm so, and I definitely, I want to, there's so many things I want to ask you guys, but maybe I can connect it here with, if we can unpack this a little bit, because you mentioned the, quatrefoil axis mundi. And again, like, I'm going to keep just telling people, just go get the book. But let me, see if I can summarize this and see if you can just tell me if it's a good kind of summary, that we have the I should have had a graphic, but that's okay. The four-petaled flower, right?
Hmm.
That the this quatrefoil figure, which as you went through, becomes very emblematic throughout that. What was it again? The which Olmec, the middle. I want to get it right.
The middle
Middle
formative
formative,
Olmec,
and then up
which
through the
through the classic Maya,
Maya. Yep.
all the
Okay.
way up until the
Teotihuacan, which
Teotihuacan
Teotihuacan.
period.
they were alive at the time of
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. So all
Right.
this flower
It's a
world
long
belief
period.
is growing and developing over thousands
Yes.
of years, not decades. So yeah.
And this is and to anyone who's not sure what we're talking about. So the flower world is it? I'm sure it's an oversimplification, but their vision of sort of the pure, perfect afterlife, that is filled with basically this incomprehensibly heightened sensory experience, right? This fullness of smell and of sound and this iridescence, like so that was painted so beautifully. I thought the idea of, because I think so often even in our Christian mentality, sometimes we fall into this almost like well, heaven's like this shadowy kind of like I don't know what it's going to be like. And I know, like C.S. Lewis I love so much for being able to get across that idea of no, it's more like it's more real, it's more perfect. This is the world of the shadows, the shadowlands, right? And this almost seems to me like that's their kind of understanding too, that you have glimpses or connections with these ultimate realities, like you were saying, Joseph, this Platonic kind of idea. Could you say it's almost like a pre-sacramental notion that there's like instances in this world of a little taste of what might be to come, but I couldn't dare imagine what it's like in its fullness? Is that kind of their image of paradise in a nutshell? Or
Yeah, I think we could definitely say that. It's a sort of a signal grace. Maybe it was a vision, maybe it was a dream. We're not quite sure, but they're giving a view in time where God parts the veil and allows them to see this
yeah,
more perfect reality. And so everything in the culture is wanting to obtain that reality
And to go to
and
this
to, and to
right,
go to
place.
this place. And we see that in their song poems, and we see that in their
yeah,
pyramids, their murals, so many different physical ways that they're trying to quote unquote incarnate this reality that was viewed at a particular point in time. They're trying to make it real, right? And
yeah,
you see that over and over and over. You
Yeah,
want to
and
speak to that?
and of course, if we believe that God's message is universal, of course He would be wanting all people of the world to come to Him. So things are done in so many different ways. Of course, in chapter 2 we bring up the idea of evangelical preparation, or preparatio evangelica,
yes,
accepted Christian doctrine. Well, these are ways in which God reaches out to even pagan cultures in order
yeah,
to, in a way, implant concepts and ideas, which when the gospel message comes to them, kind of like a light bulb goes up and says, oh, okay, this
yeah,
is what you're talking about.
Mhm,
This flower world paradise
mhm.
is what the missionaries are trying to get to us. This
sure,
concept of being able to reach a transcendental reality is Jesus Christ in the
Yeah,
Eucharist, for example.
sure.
yeah.
I think of like Paul, right, famously walking through the the
Temple of
agora, I
Mars.
guess, and he sees the
Yeah,
the temple to an unknown God, and that's his like, let me tell you about
absolutely.
this unknown God. He's like,
Hmm.
I got some information on
Hmm.
him.
Hmm.
But it's so fascinating because like some things that just jumped out at me as I was reading through some of the setup here is this, this impulse, right, for the
Hmm.
that axis. It's such a cool, like there's even a mathematical thing to it, right? There's the dimensions, the plane that we sort of operate on most of the time. I can go this way and that way, and so then there's a cross, and I'm like, wait a
Hmm.
minute, and then but also that vertical axis, which I've seen in other cultures sometimes referred to, right, as that it's like almost like the tent pole of the cosmos.
Hmm.
And so you
Or the
get this
world, yeah.
this three-dimensionality that some sense, and of course you have a lot more stargazing back then,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
I've
They
seen the
didn't have
stars, and
iPads.
no, and when I was in the army, it was in Arizona, and I've never seen the stars like I saw them here,
Mm.
Mm.
and it's just like that's all I wanted to do. It's just like wow, and it makes a lot more sense. But I guess
Hmm.
what I'm getting at here is this is so interesting to me that you have God planting these seeds, this idea, right? The impulse to sort of ascend the mountain, right?
Hmm.
Or to enter into the cave, which is
Hmm.
symbolic of death. And I'm writing in my notes, on the margins of your book, I'm like, Jesus was born in the cave, Jesus dies and
Yes.
he's buried in the cave,
He
all those
prayed in
kinds
a
of things.
cave. Yeah.
Right, right. And
Hmm.
so all these sort of universal concepts that make a lot of sense. But might you also say, I want to throw this out there, could it be possibly that when you see like that impulse to build essentially on the darker side of this, right, the building of this temple, right, sort of a man-made mountain that we ascend to in this horrible, case of offering the heart of someone else, right, the blood sacrifice where I don't make it myself, but I'm taking someone else's heart. If I do it enough, I might appease the gods. It's amazing that even something as barbaric as that can be seen as maybe a twisted impulse that at the core of it, they're still on to something, right?
Oh, yes.
So, yeah, so that like a parallel, right, to this far more peaceful image just down the street, this idea.
Well, that was a question that came up often when we were before we wrote the book. We gave several different presentations, and what was really hard for people to I guess to accept is that we're over here talking about flowers and we're talking about poetry
right,
and that the Aztecs wrote poems, and it was hard for people to
how did they coexist?
And we were saying, no, really, the Aztecs wrote poems. That was a big part of their life,
and they're very deep. It was very metaphysical, right?
Right.
Yes.
And I what we had to really explain is that there were divisions, that different kind of concepts could have run parallel with each other. For example, you could have polytheism, but you could have dualism too at the same time. The idea of a dualistic God, death and life, light and dark, good and evil, etc.
And alongside that, monotheism at the same time.
Which did actually happen. And we explained that when we talked about Nawa philosophy. But the thing about it is that what seems to happen in so many different cases, for example, in the 1400s, really when the human sacrifice had a tremendous uptick. This is when we see the tens of thousands of sacrificial victims. Well, that started in the 1450s.
That was a new thing. That was not something that was always there.
Right. It was about 70 years before Cortes arrived. But basically, the idea that they actually obtained the sacrificial victims were called the Flower Wars. And the reason why they were called the Flower Wars is when you look at the poetry that's associated with it, it's basically warrior kings that are going off to battle. And their desire is that if they die in battle, if they shed their blood, that they would turn into hummingbirds and butterflies
to go to the flower world
paradise. So many of these kind of concepts that we see as beautiful, they get twisted, they get manipulated for the leaders.
We call it elite manipulation,
right?
Of these ideas.
And this isn't our idea. When we talk about this in archaeology finds, for example, in the Olmec period, in the Middle Formative, we find an altar and we find this kind of king at the entrance of this cave, which is the place where you get to the flower world paradise. And the way it's interpreted by anthropologists and archaeologists is the leader is placing himself as a bit of an arbiter of who gets to go to the flower world paradise, who gets to go to the afterlife. And of course, this serves their end. And that's what, when you read these papers and books, that's the conclusion that these scholars are coming up with. So different ideas like Platonic realism, the allegory cave can get changed, and it happened in Mesoamerica.
Yeah. Well, and so let me maybe we can pivot here, because now as we get right to that dawn of the Spanish period, right? You've got Juan Diego, who is an early Christian convert, who was, if I remember correctly, only in his teens, right, when that massive 10 to 80,000, we don't really know, human sacrifice was made in the late 1480s. This very dark period, right? And that he becomes one of the first converts. And to sort of set the stage here for the Guadalupe event, so we have this ancient song poem, right? The origin of the song. There's origin of the song's plural, right? I think.
Origin of the technical term is origin of song.
Origin of song. Okay.
Origin of song. So
song meaning all
songs. It's referring to all the songs. Yeah.
Okay. So that's
an inference.
This formative kind of hero's journey, and you guys walk through a great, I thought, summary of that. That Joseph Campbell's kind of framing of that, and this universal kind of story, which is, I don't want to get controversial, but that's why the original Star Wars movies are better than the new ones.
I do agree with you.
in my opinion.
We
No,
agree.
but you know, and you see that it's all. I mean, it's a formula. Just I think it works because I think that's just life, right? Don't we all have something like that? But that you have this character who wants to and dreams of attaining that entrance into the flower world, and he encounters this sort of mythical hummingbird guide, right? The mentor figure who guides him, and he makes this journey upward, right? He collects the flowers, or he thinks he does, but he's not sure. And by the end of it, there's sort of this unsatisfying ending, right? It's kind of a tragic myth because he's not worthy to enter. And so though he has that impulse to gather these flowers and give them, to the lords and princes, correct? So those are some of the elements, and you guys go in a lot of detail, of course, setting the stage here. So maybe connect the dots here a little bit for us. Once we actually get to the event itself, how does that play out, and what are some of those connections you guys found?
Well, what's interesting is, you brought up a few of the little components of that original song. And what's great is that in the Nika Mopoa, which is the official account of Our Lady of Guadalupe, in the native Nahuatl language, you find Juan Diego, the very first words he's saying is he's connecting himself to that ancient poem. And how does he do that? He says, "Am I worthy of what I hear?" And then he says, "Could I be in the place my ancient ancestors spoke of?" And then he uses a term which is used in that poem as well as all the other flower song poems, which we translate as the flower world paradise. But he says the word in Xochitlalpan, in Tonacatlalpan. It's the exact term that's used to describe this place for the ancients. You want to say something quick?
I just to fill in the dots.
There's no ambiguity, in other words, about what he's talking about. Yeah.
So I mean, basically, we're talking about all these flower song poems, and there's similarities through them, throughout. One of them is the idea of a flower. When you read these flower song poems, they use the word flower song interchangeably, but they also use the word truth interchangeably. So when the singer is wanting to call the flowers down from heaven, they say, "I call down my flowers, I call down my songs." And then they say, "My songs are truth." They use these words.
And they're very unambiguous about that.
But in this one particular song, the Cuicapacayot, or the origin of the songs, it's a narrative where the singer is looking for the flowers. The hummingbird seems to bring this flower, this singer, within a mountain where he finds this flower world paradise, and he thinks he's there, so he cuts the flowers. He puts them in his tilma, and he brings them to the lords and princes, and they rejoice. And they specifically talk about a title of a god called the God of Far and Near.
Some of what maybe Mike didn't explain to the viewer is that in that original song, it seems like he didn't go there, but he explains why. The singer explains why he thinks he didn't go there. And the singer says it's because I'm not worthy. Right. I am afflicted and I sin on earth. But the God of Far and Near can make me worthy of this flower world paradise. So the song, it ends in a lament with an explanation of why he couldn't go there. It's like this eternal cliffhanger that's lasting over hundreds and thousands of years, where you have a singer representing the humanity of Mesoamerican man, wanting to go to a place, knowing he isn't worthy, and knowing that the God of Far and Near can make him worthy. So this transitions into the Nika Mopoa, that Guadalupan account. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to say. So it's a paradise lost story, which is a common thing that you find throughout pagan cultures. It's a way that a pagan man can explain this world that he lives in that is not right. Yeah. So it's a narrative that explains that, but also it's a failed hero story, because the hero, in this case the singer, did not find the flowers, and because he couldn't find the flowers, he couldn't go to the flower world paradise. So this eternal cliffhanger is what sets up the Count of Guadalupe with Juan Diego. So that's part one. But now what we're going into, what most people know about, which is the Nika Mopoa, or the Guadalupe story. And as Monique said, it starts with Juan Diego going into this beautiful place, hearing these birds singing, seeing all these iridescent
Yeah.
rocks and
Mhm.
emeralds and things like that.
It's light.
And the
Yeah.
first thing out of his mouth is, "Am I worthy of what I hear?" Which is a very
Mhm.
strange thing to say, unless you would have been familiar with the previous myth, where it
Right.
ends with the singer not being worthy to enter this
Mhm.
beautiful place. So, as Monique was saying, he sets us on this journey. He
Mhm.
even says, "Could this be the place that our ancient ancestors spoke of?" So,
Yeah.
I hope we're answering your question.
That's a really good point, because I think, like if it's me,
Mhm.
and I mean, you would almost expect the story, the guy stumbles into this visionary experience, this incredibly unusual supernatural experience. You would almost expect him to say something like, what is going on? What is
Mhm.
happening? What is this about?
Mhm.
But that phrase, am I worthy of this, is almost like it's of course, in this context, it makes total sense that there's already an interpretation that's taking place. There's already a connection as he's
Automatically, yeah.
encountering it. That's what he's immediately primed, right? And for
Mhm.
thousands
Mhm.
of years to kind of see this as it's just it's
Mhm.
incredible.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And we make a case. We say that, as hard to believe as it would be that the throughout the Aztec Empire, there were schools,
Mhm.
and they were
Yeah.
mandatory. Most of the
Mhm.
Yes.
subjects and they would have been sent to them. And of course, because Juan Diego, he was a citizen of Cuautitlan, which would
Hmm.
have actually put him more in line with. I know we get very technical, but the
Yeah.
Aztec Empire was actually known of three different groups. Two
Hmm.
of them were the most powerful, of course, the Mexica.
Which is
Hmm.
what everybody knows.
Everybody
Right.
knows
knows
them
as
as
the
the
Aztecs.
Aztecs. But the
And that's what
second
the name of Mexico goes back to that name,
To
doesn't
that
it?
one
goes back
group,
Yeah.
to
to
the
one
to the
group
Right.
of people.
Mexica. But the
Yeah.
second group were known as the Alcoa, or the people who were from Texcoco.
Hmm.
Now, Juan Diego Cuautitlan was close to Texcoco and would have been primarily under their rule. Now,
Sure.
Their influence,
their
really.
Yeah.
influence and under their rule. So the Texcoco was really known as the place that carried on many of these flower song traditions,
Hmm.
the writing of poetry,
Mhm.
the painting, the arranging of beautiful feathers, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. Yes.
So he would have been schooled in this. He
Mhm.
would have known the term the flower paradise, or in his Nahuatl language, in
Hmm.
Xochitlalpan, in Tonacatlalpan. And of course, we know that because he labels this place in that way, this beautiful place, when he nears Tepeyac Hill.
Mhm.
So we can learn
Yeah.
so much about Juan Diego, his education, what he knew, what he didn't, the fact that he said, "Am I worthy to be here?" I mean,
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
there's just a
Yeah.
wealth of information, but you would only really know it unless you
Mhm.
know the history, the
Mhm.
flower song poems and everything else.
Sure.
So that's why we say it's important to
Mhm.
know this if you really want to take a deep dive into the
Mhm.
Guadalupe story.
Well, and
And
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
sorry.
Yep.
No, I was just going to say to
Yeah.
go, not only take a deep dive into the Guadalupe story, but to understand its relevance to the indigenous, as
Yes.
well as
Yeah.
its long-term relevance to even to us today.
Right. Well, and there's just so many little details. Like I jotted down, so he, Juan Diego encounters Our Lady. She sends him on this mission. Of course, he
Hmm.
goes and he attempts to speak to Bishop. Is it Bishop Zumarraga? I believe. Is
Zumarraga.
it Zumarraga? Zumarraga. Who doesn't, he hears him out, and it's just, but I think, to be fair, he's being a cautious bishop, right? As you should
It's
be.
prudent. It's
But
prudent.
he's very prudent. I even like the little detail. I didn't know this before, of sending the guys to keep an eye on him, but then they get, they lose him,
Mhm.
and it's like how you can just sort of in a really human way. I found myself, of all things, just really for a minute or two thinking about, like, what was going through those guys' heads then? Like, oh, I gotta go tell the bishop we
Yeah.
lost him, But
Mhm.
the fun little detail I thought, that you hear this, you hear the story growing up in different ways. You hear the summaries of the story. I, for one, I knew that he had diverted his path right on that third encounter,
Mhm.
because he's concerned about his uncle, and Our Lady kind of cuts him off at the pass, right, and encounters him there. But I thought it was so fascinating that you guys mentioned that essentially causes him to approach in a different way than he had before. Right, that now
Yes.
there's this East-West movement, which then
Yes.
you, of course, tied in culturally. Could you speak a little bit about that? And I had a follow-up connected to that I thought was interesting too.
Sure. Well, one of the key components of that flower world belief system, there's many of them, Well, one of them in particular is the necessity of the soul to reach the flower world paradise by traveling in an east to west direction. He can't get in there unless he follows that particular directional access.
Yeah.
So when Juan Diego, in the story, it seems like he's trying to avoid his destiny. But what's funny is that in trying to avoid it, he actually is able to complete it in the old system of belief, which allows
Yeah.
the indigenous to recognize that all the aspects are matching up exactly with their ancient quest, even
Yeah.
down to that last little detail as he approaches and actually obtains the flowers on that last day by traveling in an east to west direction. Before he
Yeah.
was on the west side facing east, he wouldn't have been able to gather the flowers unless he did that.
That's what jumped out at me was so cool was that's and you guys didn't specifically address this, but what immediately jumped out at me was I'm in an Old Testament sort of unit with my students right now,
Okay.
and I was blown away because Adam and Eve, of course, when they sin, they are cast out, or they're cast out to the east.
Correct.
And the whole focal point of ancient Jewish priestly sort of liturgical practice, that all of the bells and whistles, all of the ceremony of this, it's this constant movement from east to west, right into the tabernacle in the desert. All those years that they had the tabernacle in the desert, when they build the temple in Jerusalem, it's this, you ceremonially approach the Lord, the Holy of Holies, from east to west, as this, this increasing act of humility to attempt to be drawn back into paradise, and I just thought, Lord, you didn't have to do any of this. You know what I mean? Like, and even that connection, right, to make this across the world, and which they wouldn't know that reference, but I'm sure in subsequent study, right, in connection with their newfound faith, that's something that could potentially dawn on them as well. That's another connection.
Yeah, it's kind of fun because even eschatologically, we have that
Yeah.
where Jesus is said in the end of time to be approaching from the east to the west through the Golden Gate into Jerusalem. So it's kind of funny. You see that on the indigenous side too. It's matching.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. And so now with the actual arrangement, and again, like our point here, and what I found really interesting about the book too is, there is so much about the tilma itself, the image, this miraculous image that the Lord has given to us, but that's not really the point of the book, is it? You don't necessarily focus on that as much. You don't dismiss it, of course. But I think what was really interesting, and I wanted to ask you guys about this, and make sure I don't forget to ask about this as we get a little closer to the end of our time here for now. Something that I really thought was fascinating was, I think a lot of people, myself included, have had this idea that, okay, well, this miraculous event happens, he brings, he's admitted, right, to see the bishop, and the tilma is opened and the flowers come out, and there's that miraculous image, and it's just this globe changing event, which is partially true. But something you mentioned I had never thought of before was, how many people actually saw it? I mean, of the 9 or 10 million, like 8 to 10 million people, like, I just never thought of that before. It's not like probably most of the indigenous people are immediately seeing it, that there's something more to this.
Can I lay it up for you?
Okay. Yeah, so please do, because that was how you set up this whole, like, how the message got out was fascinating to me.
Well, I think something we like to sort of centralize the idea is that it's a lot of artistic ideas all weaving together to make a larger case for belief, not just one component or another. So that's just to start off with that point. And the second point is that
well, let me jump off that.
Yeah, you want to jump off that?
The reason why that's such an important point is because so much pressure is put on the tilma then.
Yeah.
It seemed kind of like a one-legged stool, right?
Right.
So essentially, if you could knock the tilma and you can say, well, it's frauds and it was painted by this Indian, all this other stuff.
Just wave it all away, yeah.
Then, which is basically what happens in the secular scholastic world. But however, I don't know why. I mean, this Nama philosophy and this poem's been around for decades, and there's been translations of it. In fact, that was part of our initial research. We thought, well, why hasn't anybody else connected the dots
and dealt with the questions that come from that?
It seems so obvious to us. And the more and more that we got into this, we saw this fight, so to speak, this effort to knock Guadalupe. And that is actually a point, because if it were to be the tilma that was the primary conversion agent, then there would be more evidence of millions of people going to Tepeyac.
Right.
And when you read the conversion accounts, that's just not the case.
Wow.
And we're not,
Yeah.
as you said, the
We're not.
tilma is miraculous.
Without
There is no
question.
doubt about that in our minds. And,
Mhm.
But he did
even
more than that.
But
the
He did
Lord
more
did
than
more
that.
than that. Yeah.
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 We like to say that the tilma is the tip of the iceberg of
Sure.
a huge network of ideas that work to convert them, not only
Yeah.
just on a it is all supernatural, but maybe in a more immediate, visceral way with the tilma. But
Yes.
there's a lot of intellectual preparation that was made through their ideology, that and a story, a grand meta narrative that we say that this ancient song poem, as we were saying before, it started the story, but Our Lady of Guadalupe ended the story, and they would have been able to take that in on a more human level and understand, oh, God is looking out for us. He loves us. He loves us so much that he's planning things for thousands of years.
Yes.
We can trust in a God that is speaking through our traditions, which was very essential for them.
right.
It's almost like the tilma is like a super upgraded quatrefoil. Like
Yes.
this sign, this ultimate sign of this covenantal reality. Because what blew my mind was, you just made the simple point that's like, look, you've got, that was a big thing that, I was stunned by when I started reading the primary sources, like I said earlier, because I think I just had this idea, like Cortez comes over with like, a million Spanish conquistadors and just completely, it's like, wasn't a whole lot of people in the grand scheme, like grossly outnumbered, like absolutely required to be making different alliances with different local groups and stuff. And that whole political dynamic was fascinating to me when I first read about it. And then by extension, though, I hadn't thought about, well, you've got, what was the estimate? Like a couple dozen, just a few decades in, a couple dozen Franciscan priests, for millions and millions of indigenous peoples. And that you have them start after what was the name for the local, like, I'm sorry, the Nawa, like the wise men, the
Tlamatini man.
Yes, the Tlamatini.
Tlamatini
And so
man.
how they carry the story out, and they sort of, it's almost become like, John the Baptist kind of in the wilderness sort of, and that you have this, people start showing up like en masse, having heard that was fascinating to me,
Yeah, just to kind of point to the statistical reality is that when Cortez came here, there were only a few thousand Spaniards. So in order to defeat the Mexica, which is one group of people, which is about 200 to 300,000 people, you got to make up those numbers. And they made up the numbers from all of their neighbors because, there's something I was seeing.
Happy about the human sacrificing,
right,
for one thing.
Right. Right. So that whole idea, I was seeing a lot of fights on Twitter with, on Columbus Day and everything. And the human sacrifice was horrific. There's no question about that. But it was one particular group that was imposing that on a large number of people, many of them who could have outnumbered them. And I think when the Spanish got there, it galvanized. It gave them the belief that they could change that. So they got 200, 300, 400,000 indigenous in the surrounding area and in the vicinity of the Valley of Mexico to conquer the Mexica. So it wasn't the Spanish didn't conquer them; the indigenous conquered their own. So that's an important point. You want to say?
Well,
something?
it was primarily the areas like Tlaxcala, which were the main group that the Mexica would go and raid in order to get sacrificial victims. But also, as I brought up before, the second in power of the Triple Alliance, the Alcoa from Texcoco, they also allied with Cortez. So did Juan Diego's hometown of Cuautitlan. So all these different places all basically, got together to defeat the Mexica. But once the Franciscans started to come in 1524, it's so interesting. The chronicler of that, which should have been Friar Motolonia, he's talking about the mass conversions that they were starting to see. And he even does a calculation. He says, it's kind of funny because he's saying, okay, we know that there's about 60 of us on the ground.
I love the math. Like he's sketching it out. Okay.
He's sketching. And then he goes, but you know what? 20 of them don't know Nahuatl really well. They're too sketchy. So we got to kind of X those guys out. So I would imagine there's only really 40 of us
priests
on the ground. And then he starts going into the calculation of how many per day
We're
per
coming
thousand
to
were
him.
coming. And he's saying, well, if there's 40 and like 1,500 were baptized on this day, and then he goes,
Yeah.
that's when you get, that's how you get the
Yeah.
9 million conversions, because he calculates it.
I love how personal it is. He's like, it's
very
me,
personal.
it's Jose, it's Albert. Like he's going down the list. Like,
And I know this guy baptized this many people last Sunday, and he averages about the same every day.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. But speaking to your, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking to your point, a lot of those accounts are saying how they're going to 200 miles out, and then they're having thousands of people at that location rushing to the priest saying, baptize me. And he's thinking, the priests are wondering, why in the world are they asking for baptism from the first time they're seeing them?
Right.
You know, and that it's at a great distance from Mexico City, sometimes 100, 200, 300 miles out. They're having people rushing to them from even further out, a couple hundred miles.
Right.
How is that working? What's motivating them? And that's
it's like
where the story
he's got
comes
his
in.
notes for like his first like really awesome sermon. He's like, this will really convince him. He's like, oh, okay, all right.
It's happening anyway.
It's happening anyway.
Yeah,
right. What's converting them?
And you know what's seen in these codices, they're not only talking about the music schools, but they're talking about how the wise men, the Tlamatine men that we were just talking about, how they would write a poem and then it would get replicated. It would become memorized. It would go from music school to music school to music school. And anything that was of importance, a historical event, a beautiful flower song poem, of course, the origin of the song would have gotten out. This was just the tradition, the way that news got out. So
they turned it into a song and then passed it along.
It passed along, and that would explain how the word would have gotten out. You know, hundreds, possibly thousands of miles. And that's perhaps can explain why so many of them came from far away in order to come in. And it also helps explain the numbers. Because, you know, this was during the time of plague. So millions had already died from the plague by that point. So it would have had to have been a huge geographical area in order to obtain those numbers, which, by the way, is another point that secular scholars
use against
Our Lady of Guadalupe. And not only that, but we have an eyewitness account of a priest, Becerra Tanco, who says that he saw the Guadalupe flower song, that's what we call it. He saw that performed in the plaza, in the city square. He explains it, and he says he's been here. This has been part of the oral tradition for decades and decades. And you know, so it actually did happen that way. We have an eyewitness from history.
You know, it's so funny to me because I think this could be a whole other topic, but I'll just mention. I mean, it's, you know, I think we're too quick. Sort of our current culture, right, is too quick to dismiss the power and the staying power of oral tradition, and it's just so easily debunked though, because I remember the words to Living on a Prayer, like if I haven't heard it for like 4 years and I'm out somewhere and it comes on, like, you know,
Hotel
like
California, you know,
right, like you haven't activated that memory in years, and it just comes. So if you're repeating it all the time, and it's not even just something that's like a fun aspect that's nostalgic, but like this is part of like, if you don't pass this on to your kids, it dies. Like this is who you are. Like this is everything. Yes. And you know, you sing it. Oh no, you got that. Let's try it again. Let's try it again. Do it again. And then, sure, writing it down that helps. You know, but I think it's the power of that is often missed by, I think, a lot of moderns.
Well, you know, there's so much evidence that even you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey existed in oral tradition for so many years. I mean, you have like Song of Roland, or you have so many of these different pieces that were written in verse. And part of the reason they're written in verse is so that they could be easily memorized. And that they could carry on within the oral tradition. There's also the idea that sometimes in certain cultures, things that are written down are actually not trusted as much. You know, are you gonna trust what you see in a book, or are you going to trust what your grandfather told you at bedtime?
There's a tendency to trust the tradition.
So you know, and as we were bringing up before when we were talking about historical documents, you know, academia goes in waves, right? So the thing is that because so much that we know about what happened with Guadalupe and what we know about Juan Diego, for example, was through oral testimony. And many academics really put it down. But
Pillory.
now
It's changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah, we've noticed. We go to these different conferences. We read these different papers, and it seems as if it's more accepted. So our argument would be, well, then if it's more accepted, then you must then believe that Juan Diego existed, which is another kind of bugaboo that's in the academic circles, because that was the argument before. Well, it was just oral history, oral
and you
testimony.
can't trust oral history.
You can't really test it,
Right.
Trust it. But anyway, that's a little bit of insight. But it shows the importance of oral history and tradition.
Well, we're close to, unfortunately, we're close to our time here. There's so much more I want to talk to you guys about, but let me just maybe ask you in our sort of closing couple of minutes, just any really key takeaways. I mean, I wrote down near the end when I was reading, this was just a thought I had. I said, I wrote, when heaven is the goal, what won't we sacrifice for it? But if it's anything less, even community, good things like community activities, liturgy, like the liturgy itself, if there's anything that we focus on, how deep does our faith really go? And I just thought, you look at like what these people were willing to put it all on the line, right? The moment that real connection, where they see someone who looks like them, sounds like them, just this common man, he's entered the flower world paradise, let's go. And I just thought that is what an amazing, especially in that time of real darkness that so many of them encountered. That was a message I thought for our times, when we tend to like, what's our highest good? And if it's my status in the world, or it's anything other than I want to be with God forever. I mean, that made 8, 9, 10 million people come to Christ. It's just astonishing to me. And so that was a big takeaway for me. So as far as you guys, if there's something that's a big, something you want to leave everybody with or encourage people with.
I think there's two. That the first one is definitely indicative of the second one, but what you were just saying, how important is heaven to us? And a lot of times we need that incentive to help us in staying in the Christian life. But the main one we always focus on with this book is God is in control of history. Because if he could spend that much time, in this particular case, we think up to 3,000 years to prepare a people for the gospel message so that it can flower at the right time and under the right circumstances, then it can give us a certain measure of hope that even when things are at their darkest, and it was pretty dark in 1531 or right before, leading up to those days, very, very dark days, not only in the Americas, but in Europe. And when Guadalupe came, it flipped it overnight, right?
Yeah.
How much more so can we apply that to today's times when things are chaotic and tumultuous?
Yeah, sure.
It seems dark, it seems hopeless, but God plants things way ahead of time. He's foreseeing it all. There's nothing that's going to go outside of his grasp. So that's maybe the main takeaway for us.
Right. And I would kind of piggyback off what you were saying, is that what would you sacrifice? What would you give up to attain eternity or the beatific vision? As we could see that, first of all, ancient Mesoamerican man was so preoccupied
Obsessed
with the afterlife, with eternity, and wanting to go to this beautiful paradisal realm. So when they found the key, when Juan Diego found those flowers of truth that came down from heaven, when he showed to his people the way in which you can unlock that key is through baptism, boy, they craved it. They came crying and begging. And even though they even forced the Franciscans to kind of bend the rubrics a little bit, which they got a little bit in trouble for, which we explain in the book. But the tears and the begging was so extreme that they gave in, and they said, okay, we're going to baptize you. And as we explain, all those barriers that were keeping the indigenous from being baptized in the first place before Guadalupe appeared, such as polygamy, having many wives, which was very economically beneficial to their household. Slavery was rampant. So many different things that they would have to give up. They even made amends to ill-gotten gains that they may have taken from their neighbor, maybe land that they had stolen. They
It's
were
like
making
Zacchaeus in the gospel, right? Paying
Yeah.
it back, and
Pay it back.
They paid it back. The
Wow.
priest would give them a penance, and they would say, "Is that
Right.
all?" You know,
Give me
A little bit
more.
more,
Really?
Father.
Yeah. Thank you, Father. Give me more. That kind of thing. But it just shows how much they craved this paradisal eternity, to live
Yeah.
in beauty, to live with music, with
Mhm.
beautiful colors, iridescence,
To possess
Yeah.
heaven,
to
basically.
possess it with their Creator for eternity. So I
Yeah.
think that's another big takeaway, that
Mhm.
we as Catholics, as
Mhm.
Christians, and
Yeah.
even non-Christians, I mean,
Mhm.
we should be thinking about the afterlife
Mhm.
and saying, where are we going?
Mhm.
Where, is there a heaven? Is there a hell? And if there is, and I'll wager to believe that there is, let's go to heaven.
Yeah.
So
Let's do whatever it takes.
let's do whatever it takes to get
to go to
there.
heaven. Yeah.
Well, Joseph and Monique, this has been delightful. I have so many more questions. I'll have to save them for now. But we definitely direct
Feel free.
We
Feel
could
free.
to the book.
we could
Yeah.
Do another one if you want.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on today, and just for sharing your time in this wonderful book, and definitely
Sure, no, thank
encourage you to keep it up, and maybe
Mhm.
there's more in here for volume 2. I don't know. We can unpack them even more. So,
Ooh.
There's more.
well, thank you guys.
Okay.
We'll see you later. Take care.
God
All right,
bless. Thank you,
Mike.
Mike.
God bless you. See you later.
Now, being a high school teacher cues me into some pop culture things. They come and go, but this is still a thing, right? Like, mind blown. I was absolutely thrilled. This was an absolutely amazing read. You got to get it. Look at this. I've got all these. Oh, man, that's just so many awesome things in here. And I can't recommend it more to you. And what a wonderful time to do it, too, in this Advent season, as we have these wonderful feasts that the church gives to us to remember this incredible event. As we're nearing in the next few years, just a few years away from the time of this recording, the wonderful 500th anniversary of this wonderful appearance of Our Lady, which absolutely changed the world. I really recommend that you get this. It might be a great Christmas gift as well. So thank you so much for stopping by today on the Gracious Guest Show. And until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.